I'm not muted anymore. Hi, welcome. This is the 12th episode of the Design System Social Club. Today, I'm very pleased to have Donna with me. Hey, Donna, how's it going? Donna, you're muted, but hi.
Hi.
Muted. You know what? It's April Fool, so we're gonna all start muted. I think that's the joke. Hey, Donna, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. For the people who don't know, Donna is a design lead at TELUS Digital. She's also the host of Design System Toronto Edition. And we're very happy to have you today. And also with us, we have Danny. Thanks. Hey, Danny. How's it going?
Hello.
You're
It's going
the
good.
professional here that doesn't mute himself before starting to talk, so good for you.
Yep.
And Danny is a principal design technologist at AWS and also the creator of Style Dictionary. So that's pretty cool. We're happy to have you today.
Yep. I was happy to be here.
Yeah, cool. So today is a little bit of a new stuff for us. We're going to try to answer questions and maybe ask each other questions too. I feel like there might be some, there's definitely, I was thinking about that. There's definitely some stuff that I actually want to ask you both. So we'll see about that. But maybe I'm going to start with like an announcement, first of all. During the night, we passed our 1,000 followers on Twitter. So that's
Woo.
I was pretty happy about that. Unfortunately, the guy is in Vietnam, so I don't think he's going to join us. But I offered, so that was maybe for the next, for the 2001, we'll do it again. Anyway, cool. For anybody who's joining or about to join and want to ask questions, you can ask questions in the comments, and we can take them live and see what we can do with them. In the meantime, I'm just gonna look at stuff that we had. And so first question that I had, apart from Kelly, who was for whatever reason not happy, but okay, here's Henry's question. Design system, where do you think we are in this cycle? So basically technology trigger, peak of inflated expectation, truth, how do you pronounce that? Truth of delusionment? Anybody?
The trough.
Trough.
Yeah.
Hey, I learned a word today. That's good.
Or valley. You could say, it's the valley.
Oh, okay. Slope of enlightenment and plateau of productivity. That's a very good question. Who wants to go first?
I can go first because I'm already unmuted. I think we are at the slope of enlightenment. Because the kind of peak of inflated expectations, like design systems so hot right now. Like I feel like that was a few years ago, when things were kind of really starting to get exciting and stuff like that. I think we've gone through like a year or two of like, okay, everyone's doing design systems now, and I think we're starting to I think there's still more that we can get to reach that plateau of productivity.
Yep.
I think we're still kind of scratching the surface, but I think we're on that upward slope of enlightenment right now.
Okay. I think you're an optimistic, and I like that.
I'm a realist.
How do you feel about it?
I agree. I think we're going up the slope of enlightenment. I still see like a lot of calls for design system designers and developers, for product owners as well. So I see like there's like a hunger for people to work on design systems. So I think people know the value of it and want to include it in organizations big and small kind of thing. So I think we see it and acknowledge it, and people want to work on it.
Okay. It's funny because I looked at this and I was thinking about it on my own before the show. And to me, like, there's also something to say about, like, depending on where you are, in what industry you're in, like, I feel like for us, like, I mean, I don't want to debate like when design systems started or not. For me, it was around like 2014, 2015 when it started to be known. I'm sure it existed in some form, and the term might be coined before that. I know Gina would probably have, probably have an opinion on this. but I feel like 2014, 2015 for me is like kind of where it started. That said, and I feel that's a while now, but at the same time I feel like it's probably something very new for a lot of people. So depending who you are and where you are, like, are you like plugged into what happens on Twitter, for example, but also like Silicon Valley in general and stuff like that. I feel like maybe we're more advanced than other places and other industries, and so I don't know. I feel like it's variable, and I can also definitely see myself, like my personal journey in that graph, but anyway, so yeah, depending on where you are, I feel like you can be like in different places in that diagram for now. For me, yeah, probably slope of enlightenment makes sense. A couple of things for me are still missing from my point of view on getting to the plateau of productivity. One of the thing is probably what a few of us are working on, but like getting design tokens really integrated in tools, and the way like things like right now I feel like we're all doing custom things, and there's like a lot of good things happening, but at the same time it's not a standard. I mean, obviously K-League is leading this effort and everything, but I don't think we're there yet. So that's one. The other big one that I would love to see is, because and that's on my personal journey, but I don't really have a good tool for documentation, and especially keeping everything. So there's a couple of things. One is keeping obviously like things in sync, between like designer tools, code, and documentation, making sure that everything is in sync. But also, I would love to not rely just on the website. And we talked a little bit about that in previous episodes, but it's not just about having like one website. I think it's about being able to surface content and documentation and help and guidance in different places. And personally, I don't believe that there's one source of truth. I think that you don't want to update stuff or duplicate stuff, everywhere, but you can have like multiple sources of truth. Design tokens might be one, for example, but it cannot just be that. And then at the same time, you probably want to surface content in different places, from like, I don't know, a Slack channel to a plugin for your designer tool to, like maybe your IDE extension where you want to be able to answer and meet your user where they are. But for me, like, this thing is not there yet. And I feel like this is probably one of the key things that is missing for me to actually get to a good place. So I don't know. How about you guys? What do you feel is missing to get to the plateau of productivity?
I think for me, it's the like connections and kind of removing the designer developer gap, and having kind of designers and developers working more in the same space, so that there's less of kind of these designer and developer silos. And I think like you said it as well, like getting documentation out of just a documentation site, and having it more integrated into where people are currently working. I think Gina wrote an article about this as well, like getting design system information into your IDE so that you don't need to have the documentation site open. Everything is just, it already exists in VS Code or whatever IDE you use. Similarly with Figma or whatever design tool you use. So I think it's, and that's where like plateau of productivity is really coming to like make a lot of sense, because that's like really where people start to become very productive, is like they don't need to context switch and they don't need to translate things, and they don't need to work in different places, but they can just all work in the same place and have all of the information that they need in where they're currently working.
Yeah, no, definitely. Cool. What about you, Donna? Do you feel like, what is missing for you to get to that plateau?
Yeah, so I agree with like, where are your source of truth in like design? Because like that's actually a complaint that complaint, like a feedback that we got from one of our users, which is, like in Figma, you have the component, but you don't have like the guidance on like what to use it, and like, oh, what are the toggles? Like it actually requires the designer to explore what the toggles are in order to see the variants. And not everybody has 100 tabs open, so it's again another lost thing that people look for. um, and then speaking of all that from the user perspective, but what about like the maintainer perspective? Like, how do we make sure that all those things are updated? Again, like, is there multiple sources of truth? And then now your team has to update all those things. I think the plateau of productivity would be if the onus is not just on that team to make sure that that's updated, right? Then it's also about the users being able to edit those things as well, or like submit changes and create their own kind of things as well. So I think if everybody, maybe it's too much, like you can't expect everybody to have all the same knowledge, I think. So maybe.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks, Anna. Well, maybe we can move on to the next question. Julie asked, what communication or training aids are drivers of direction to our users? Video, presentations, demos. How do you keep up with attrition in our users? Anybody has an answer to that?
That is a really good question. Actually, something I recently talked to someone in an interview about. I think, having huge walls of, basically just having written documentation is not probably the best, user experience for people trying to use it. Like, they don't want to just read a long page about, how to use a specific component. Having short, demo videos and stuff like that can be good, but it's also very difficult to keep like video content up to date. So like if you record a video of like the demo of a button, and then a month later you change how that button looks, or you add some property to it or some feature to it, you need to go back and re-record that video, but most people probably don't want to do that. So it's kind of, it's a double-edged sword. Like it can be very helpful, but it's also very hard to keep up to date. I think like the biggest thing for me is like having like interactive playgrounds, like storybook type things to, really, people want to like play with stuff, I think is kind of what it really comes down to. Like if you give me like a design system or some components, I just want to start by playing with them. I don't want to read documentation. And then when I get to the point where like I'm like, okay, now should I really use, what variant of the button or something like that, I can read the documentation. But really, I just want to start playing with it and seeing what it can do. So having those kind of like interactive controls, whether that's Storybook, whether that's within a custom documentation site, it really kind of depends. But I think interactive controls is most important, at least to get started and to get people interested.
Yeah. Good call. Donna, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah. So we have some of the documentation up. We have some of the video, like Figma sessions. But I think right now, as people are adopting like our design system, because we just launched it like earlier this year, the best thing really has been meeting with individual teams and almost like a one-on-one to be like, okay, so what are you trying to achieve? And these are the things that we have in place. So it's really still a one-to-one kind of conversation, and which is great because it's still building a bridge with people, and just really being supportive in that way.
Yeah, no, for sure. On my end, I was trying to think, but I feel like, first of all, I think what is important is not to have just one way of communicating. Like it has to be different things, because different solutions will resonate with different kind of people, or even the same people but at different kind of moment. Maybe there is a moment where I just need a quick answer, or like I just need to play with it and see what happens. Maybe another time I'm like, okay, really, I need to know like what are all the props of that component or whatever, or what are the guidelines or the content guidelines or like accessibility. I don't know. So there's like different things. Stuff that we do in my team right now is, for example, when we have those, we rebranded Lunch and Learn to Launch and Learn. So every time we launch a new thing, we actually have some kind of session where we explain, and we have like a demo and somebody is playing with it, like, so that's recorded, because to be honest with you, like, it's just like, obviously not everybody can be there at that time. And also, while we're doing this presentation, why not just, like, capture it and have it somewhere? I totally agree with you, Danny. The problem with those videos is that it's usually like, quote unquote, expensive to produce, and they have basically like a perishable date on it. So that's kind of unfortunate, but obviously that's also nice to have somebody that talk to you. So that's that. Usually we do also, like, for designers anyway, we have playground files that we try to. So, it's like a file that is going to explain to you what is this component, or how do you contribute to our Figma library or something like that. So, like, we're just, again, leaving it there so that people can just make a copy of it and then play with it. It's like literally a playground where we give you like instructions of what to do. With some success, I feel like those things can be updated a little bit more easier than the video, of course. But yeah, after that, I feel like the last bit for me is also like making sure that, like, in terms of I think it's related to what we were talking earlier about documentation, because I feel like a lot of the documentation website that I see for design system, and maybe that's also because they're public and huge, is that I feel like most of the time those websites are made by system people for system people, and they look more like botanical books, like scientific books, than actually a cookbook where I'm just giving you a recipe and you don't care about how many variants do I have on this particular component. I'm giving you a recipe so that you get your job done, right? And so I feel like there might be also like better training and documentation overall that actually is more actionable and it's more from the user perspective and less from the maintainer perspective. So yeah, different, for me, like, all those things are like different things to try and potentially, make available and see what clicks and what resonates with your user group, because I'm feeling like, it's probably depends on who is your audience and who are your users. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I think it also depends kind of, you mentioned this like earlier, like on the industry that you're in and kind of the type of application that you're working on. Like, before coming to AWS, I was working in like the third-party seller space, so like, very kind of business centric, and basically we had like 4 like archetypes of views. There's like lists of things, there's a detail of a thing, and there's like a form, and there's a dashboard. And every single page in an application could be one of those 4 things. And so like we could be a little bit more kind of focused like in those like different areas to guide people, like, okay, like, which type of page are you building? You're building a dashboard. Here's like the dashboard stuff, and here's like a more tailored experience to if you're building a dashboard, or you're building a list, here's like a more constrained experience. So I think it also kind of like depend on different users and kind of their I guess their state in like their experience of the design system, but also different industries and kind of different types of design systems.
Yep. No, for sure. The other thing that I was thinking about is that the other thing that we provide is kind of more of a one-to-one experience, but it's true that having, office hours can be also a great way for you to just, like, train people. Something that is, on our roadmap, but we didn't do yet, is also maybe create onboarding section, like when people join the team and like, or, like the production team anyway, like, do we have like material for onboarding people? That's, a couple of other ideas that, yeah, you can have, but yeah. Cool.
Yes. The thing with like onboarding or like documentation that like provides guidance on like how to contribute or how to create your own component is like people will want different levels of information. So it's almost like here are the phases of contribution, and that would be enough to get started. But you can't give them like the entire like micro steps, because then they'll see it again like that wall of text, like this is too much and I don't want to do this. But as soon as people see like, oh, here's the 5 phases, and then kind of walk them through like, in this first phase there are 10 steps. And the first step has also 10 steps.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, that's I did the same thing for my previous team. It's like we had like a 5-step process, and then within each of those, there's like, okay, here's what you need to do to complete this step, and it did make it more manageable, and it did kind of we tried to write it in a way that it wasn't like you're a designer, so you do this, but like you're in this state, like you're in this stage, so this needs to happen before going to the next stage. A designer, product manager, developer could do that work. It's not necessarily like this person works in this stage and this person works in the other, but like here's the work that you need to do to get into this other stage. And I think we found that was really helpful, because we were working with a lot of different teams. Some teams, it was a development team, they just had developers. Some people, it was just a product manager and they wanted to get something done. And other teams, like they had designers, they had developers, they had product managers, and so they were kind of more of like a fuller team. So there's really, depending on the type of team that is trying to contribute or trying to do something in the design system, it can be very different.
Yeah. Thanks. Cool. So that's that for the question that we had on Twitter, but Russell is asking us a question. How you determine when it's time to make a new component versus jamming more and more functionality onto an existing component? That's a good one. Thanks, Russell. Who wants to go first? Note takers.
Okay, I'll go first. Let's see if I can think about this out loud. I would think about this in terms of like composability and kind of flexibility. So for example, let's take a button, and a button could have different variants or variations, like primary, secondary, or outline. And it could be that you could just add a new, like tone, like error warning, something like that. Or you could add like an error button, a warning button. Both of those things I think are completely valid. I think I would probably tend to go with the first version, like adding a new prop. I think I would rather have a smaller number of components, and each component has slightly more properties, than more components with less properties. That being said, I'm thinking about how this would work in Figma, and it would be a nightmare, because like in Figma, you almost kind of want the opposite because of how variants work in Figma. Like for each new like variant property, now you add like n number of variants in that component. And so like for a button component, if you just add one new property, that could be 100 new variants, versus creating a new component that would be a lot less that you would have to do. So there's no right answer of when to do one versus the other necessarily, but I think, I would say it's potentially easier from like a code perspective to go with adding a new prop to a component versus creating a whole new component, at least from kind of like the developer experience side of things.
Yep. At the same time, I remember having that conversation also in a previous system where, because we had, let's take a very pragmatic example. Let's say you have a component that is a table, right? and you can have, like it's just a data table. Like you just use it to actually show data. Okay. But then maybe not even your entire organization, but let's say a group of that organization need to have more functionality to their data table because they want to be able to select rows or manipulate data or filter or like a bunch of stuff that you can do with a table. And then suddenly you're like, okay, so there's two options there, right? It's like I either make my component super complex in certain ways and bloat it so that it can do everything, even though I know that 80% of the time, nobody, like the rest of my users just want to display data. They don't care about filtering. They don't care about sorting. They don't care about selecting anything. So, it's like, then it starts to be, like, do I make two components, like a basic table and then like a deluxe version of it? Or do I have like just one that can do everything, but potentially then you're bringing, like a bulldozer to fix the bookshelf, kind of vibe. In an ideal state, and I think it's easier said than done. I like the idea that you mentioned, that is that, like you want things to be composable so that it's easy to just like inherit the basic table and then have like another component that just like inherit the base and then can augment it. That said, I feel like it's also easier said than done most of the time. Yep. So, like making it work, I think this is the ideal state. But yeah, after that, the other thing that I'm thinking personally is that what I like to think about when I'm thinking about components and do I want to add more, it's all about functionality, right? And the capabilities of that component, not necessarily how it looks. Like if it's just a styling thing, I would probably say I'm going to keep the same one. But if I'm starting to add functionalities or capabilities to a component, that might be where I feel like I tend to actually create a new component, ideally composed by something that is more, on the atomic side or something like that.
Yeah, I think you touched on something pretty important as well with kind of like composability, but also like inversion of control. Like, so basically, for the sorted table example, like you could add like props to say like, sort alphabetically, or like you could add like very specific properties, or you could just add like pass in a sorting function, and then like that opens up a ton of people could use it in a ton of different ways. Yep. And so kind of giving people like power of control over specific parts, so that they could, if they wanted to create a sortable table, they could create a sortable table and configure it how they need to configure it. And then maybe that could graduate into being a like actual like design system component in the design system, but having that kind of inversion of control so that people can really configure the component how they need to, and kind of compose the component how they need to. So you can have the very basic blocks, but also kind of compose those basic blocks into something that has maybe a more simple API, but gives users less control if they're using that. But then also they could still kind of compose their own table in some very specific way if they need to.
Yeah. Cool.
So,
Donna, do you have an opinion? Yes.
Yeah. So I feel like your examples are really great because it's like it's already like a complete component, and then you want to add more functionality to it. And I actually had a use case today where the request was, hey, can we make the link so our links have underline on it by default? Like on the page, I'll have links, and we have a request like, hey, I need to use this link without the underline first, and then have the underline when you hover. So it might seem like a really small request, but like, how do you determine when to make a new component? So like you have to ask them like, why do you want this? Like, you kind of explain the rationale, like, well, we have our links underlined by default because it's accessible indicator of like, this is an interactive thing. And so for them, they send over a screenshot like, well, we want to build this, and here we don't want those underlines. And after asking a few more questions, like, did you already speak to the design direction, that kind of stuff, we actually realized that, like, actually this is a navigation that you're putting at the top. So it's like, okay, well, this is again an area that is very specific, and this should be a component, because if you are going to remove the underline, you should have other indicators that this is interactive, selectable, all that stuff. And so it's almost like you come from a place where that user wants to have something change because they want to use an existing atomic component, but you realize actually you should build your own, you should contribute this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's interesting because you were talking about like some kind of top navigation thing, right? Like, to me, like, this is exactly the kind of stuff where I'm like, does it need to be in the design system, first of all? Because like this like top navigation is something that, yes, is everywhere, but I feel like usually it's like it's an exception to the rule. Like I would be considering, does it need to be part of the system, or is it just like an exception and it's a some kind of snowflake for very good reason, and that's okay. It's like that not everything needs to be to this. So it's almost like, do I prefer a snowflake, or do I prefer to create a new component and integrate it in the system, right? So
yeah. So if you do that, right, like the question would be like, well, do we still enable the property to be like no underline? And it's just like
it's a slippery slope to have to suddenly like no underline anywhere, because it just looks better. So
it opens up to like misuse. That's the goal of the design systems, to make like all these components very atomic, very reusable in different cases, but you don't want to lose, again, like all the design or accessibility that you kind of put into it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Cool. Well, Russell, I hope we answered your question, and if you have another one, we're here for you. In the meantime, why don't we switch to, do we have questions for each other? We can ask each other a question. And maybe one that I have for you, Danny, that I think I've never asked you is, how did you come with the idea of Style Dictionary? Like, what was the genesis of Style Dictionary?
That is a good question. I'm pretty sure you've asked me that before. Or maybe I'm just thinking of someone else. I've definitely gotten that question several times.
Okay. It was another French guy, that's why. Yeah.
Yes. So the genesis of it, so I was working on the mobile app that third-party sellers use to sell stuff on Amazon. It's an iOS Android app. There's web views in there as well. And it was kind of like spaghetti-ish code. And so like every time we would build a new feature, we would need to kind of implement that on Android and iOS and web. And making any sort of change, like I wanted to kind of change like the base text color to make it a little bit darker to be more accessible. And I just looked at our code bases, and to do that, I would need to make like a dozen changes in different files in like iOS, and a dozen different changes in Android, and a dozen different changes in web, and they would all kind of like be released separately and stuff like that. And so that's kind of where I was like, I don't think that this is a great solution, or that this is a problem that could be solved. And I really kind of wanted to make it easier to like make those changes across different frameworks and different platforms. And I wanted to kind of do it in a way like that was modular and flexible, so that in the future, if we needed to use that in some other language or platform, we end up like, we generate Java files now too, because we need to use it on the server side, that it it would be flexible enough to be able to add those things without having to like build something new into the framework itself. So kind of getting back to like the inversion of control principle, like being able to like define how you want to consume those tokens and making sure that they're like consumed in a way that makes sense to the framework and platform that's consuming it. So like Android developers don't even necessarily need to know that they're using design tokens. They're just using Android resources, which is like an Android specific thing. And iOS developers are just using like an Objective-C class or a Swift class. They don't necessarily need to know that it's coming from, you know, a design token JSON file somewhere.
Cool. Thanks for enlightening me. And it's so funny because I feel like, you know, this is definitely the kind of stuff where when it's done, you're like, yeah, of course. Like it makes so much sense that, you know, like, you know, it's like, it's so simple, but at the same time, somebody had to basically, one, come up with the idea, and two, actually execute on it. So, you know, thanks again for making it happen. I think it was, I'm sure, useful for you, but it is useful for a lot of people now. So
yeah. And I'm also seeing like new use cases pop up as well. Like my old team, they're actually working with me to use it basically as a way to define like component infrastructure so that they can then generate actual component code on different frameworks and platforms. They can say like, you know, I have a button component and a button has a label property, which is a string, and it has this property, which is that. And then it will actually generate the Android code, the iOS code, the web code from that kind of single definition. And other things like, you know, using it for string translations, like there's a lot of different like uses for it that is kind of outside the normal thinking of like a design token, but it's basically even like more distilled than that. It's like, what like structured data do you want to use to generate source code that you can then use on different platforms? And that could be a bunch of different things.
That's pretty cool. And yeah, I always had this idea in my head that I never actually put into production where I worked, but I feel like potentially one use of design token and style dictionary has to do with localization and being able to actually, you know, like localize stuff. And that means maybe like there's the obvious one, you know, like you want to like meaning of colors can be like vastly different from one culture to another, but it potentially could be like a path to go to be like super like customized, you know, like even more than usual, you know, whatever product you have, depending on who is that person and where they live and what is their culture, language, and everything. But I feel like, you know, for example, changing illustrations, changing the layout style, you know, like there's a bunch of stuff potentially that could be done. And I've never seen like, you know, style dictionary used this way, but I'm sure there's a potential there. Maybe I'll end up doing it one day.
Yeah, and I think Mina Markham did a talk about this at Clarity one time, where she described like basically tokenization of illustrations, so that you could just say like person one, and depending on the kind of locale that they're in, it might be different looking illustrations and stuff like that. And I thought that was like a really interesting and amazing idea to kind of localize images, localize graphics in that way.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think, yeah, the idea is probably like start from that talk, but yeah, that's it's pretty cool. Thanks. Cool.
I have a question, and both of you can answer. So the design system kind of process, like component creation or contribution process, how closely does that kind of mirror the design ops or like the DevOps? Like, you know what I mean? Like the design system is like its own kind of thing, but it's really reflective of like, hey, you know, this is the design process. You still need to go through these reviews before it even reaches like, I want to contribute this component, because you obviously should have design reviewed with your like design leads and your product kind of stuff as well. So how embedded, how does it mirror in order to get to the system?
That's a very good question. I can start. I feel like, first of all, it's interesting how I feel like there's a clear overlap between DevOps and design ops and design system. So, like, I think it's all coming down to, the operating system of your teams in general, and how like those things should be pretty similar and happening in parallel. Right now, I don't have a good solution for my team right now. And this is definitely something that I want to tackle for the next quarter, because I feel like, as you mentioned, in my case, one of the things that I'm struggling with is how I feel like at a very high level, like we have a good partnership with head of, like leadership, head of design, and of engineering and stuff like that. And on the IC level, individual contributors, they can reach out to us and ask us questions and come to like office hours and things like that. But it's in the middle that usually it gets a little bit more messier, in the sense that, like, I personally wish, and I want to be involved people that have more of a cross-functional, not necessarily cross-functional, but more an horizontal view of all the feature teams, for example, like they're organized in pod and stuff like that. So if I do something, from the design system that is, I don't know, like defining a pattern or something like that, like I need them to actually review that and tell us what they think, right? And so, I mean, like there's a fine balance between like having too many processes and meetings and stuff like that, and at the same time making sure that everybody aligned and making sure that the right people can see it. So I'm still thinking and debating about it. Like, can we do it asynchronously? How does that work? But yeah, and I'm thinking that I want to partner actually with our design ops to think about those things and make sure that it makes sense. And I feel like there's a good chance that it actually is pretty similar to other work and other places where you need to have that horizontal view of everything and the end-to-end experience, and not just, like reviewing that feature with that feature team. It's actually usually like when you need to go across the board, this is where I feel like we're not very well equipped right now. And here's a cat. Hi. But yeah, so I don't have a very good answer for you, right? Unfortunately. But yeah, this is definitely something that is on my mind and that I want to tackle next quarter.
Funnily enough, that cat's name is Donna as well. But yeah, I think ideally, to go back to the question, like I think it would mirror this like kind of similar design and DevOps processes. But like when we kind of talked before, like the 5-step process and like the kind of 10 steps within each thing, it might look slightly different because like, are like the customers of the thing are employees in the company, or like the first level customer are employees in the company. And so, we can talk to them and we can like get buy-in from them and kind of validate like hypotheses, I think, easier than, building a feature for like end users. But I think, ideally you would have kind of that same rigor and potentially even more rigor, because making a change in a design system, like changing, the button color or adding a new component, will have a much wider effect on end users than adding like a new feature potentially. But yeah, I don't have any like specific, like, I guess, examples of what that might look like though.
It's hard. Donna is asking the hard questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else has a question?
I have a question. For both of you, what is your favorite publicly viewable design system?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think it's hard to pick one. I think I'm navigating always around the same, like probably, like between, depend on what actually, like there's like good stuff like in different ones. Polaris is definitely one that it's kind of like a go-to. Like I probably like in the first three, that if I'm looking for something or in source of inspiration or wondering how somebody else is doing it, probably Polaris is probably one of the first one that I look at. Atlassian is actually also pretty cool. But sometimes there's like just interesting things that are happening in other places. For example, I remember that there's like super cool playbooks in Workday design system that I really like. And so it's like sometimes it's like overall it's like it's all right, or but there's like definitely like little nuggets here and there. I'm like, oh, I like that. So yeah, I also remember, for example, the first time I saw that for the Salesforce design system. I can remember. I think it's Lighthouse, right? Or maybe they changed the name. Can't remember now.
For Salesforce, Lightning.
Lightning. Yeah, I always always mixed Lightning or Lighthouse. Like I can't remember for the sake of me. But anyway, like the one time when I saw that they were using adverbs for duration, I'm like, oh, I like that a lot. So but yeah, that's probably the main source of inspiration. Carbon is pretty solid too. IBM. Yeah, I think those are my favorite ones. How about you, Donna?
Yeah, you kind of touched on Carbon is something that I kind of really looked at recently, especially when we're building our documentation. Like I looked at all that you mentioned. Like I still have maybe 12 tabs, all design systems, so I can always look at like specifically what they have, and I also like looking at kind of like the newer or even smaller design systems. So in the design systems community, we ask other people to like present present their design system, and one of the recent one, which is from Gusto. So like they have, again, a very small design system, but like it's actually pretty helpful. So I like exploring those things just to see like what are very important for people, and kind of focus and make sure that we have those things as well.
Yeah. What about you, Danny? Do you have favorite ones?
I have a few. Definitely Carbon. I like Microsoft Fluent. I think it's one of the fewer ones that really does kind of like multi-platform, and there's not a whole lot of ones that do that. I like Sprout Socials one, especially for like their design token documentation and stuff like that. I also like that there's like one part of Uber's base web design system that I really like, which is their like component theme editor. So you can like on a component documentation page, you can edit the theme properties. So like go to a button and say, I want the button background color to be something else. And it kind of updates the component. And that's something that I haven't seen in other design systems. I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. I think Polaris had that at one point. I remember like you were able to change, like there were like 10 colors that you can play with, and then everything else was basically calculated out of those 10. But I don't think it's available anymore, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, cool. I was thinking, it's funny because I was thinking also like Ant design is actually like there's like cool ideas there. Definitely. And I think it's funny how like the missing one, or the elephant in the room, I think, is material, which is at one point was probably like a pioneer in many ways. But I feel like for whatever reason I'm less inclined. Like to me it's like very Android-y now, or it's like, yeah, that's good for you and it's great and there's a lot of good stuff, but at the same time I don't know if it's because like I don't find necessarily what I want, or it's too big, or what. But I feel like I'm less drawn to it, like in the most recent years.
Well, I think what it is, at least for me, is like materials is more like a meta design system. Like you use it to build your design system, and it has kind of theming and stuff like that at the core of it. It's not like a traditional design system like like Polaris. And so I think they have been doing a lot of cool things more recently, like with their like the new material design site, I think is really well done, and like the Figma plugin that can then kind of generate Android code and stuff like that, and the theme editor experience. I think they're definitely moving in really interesting and cool directions that I like to see. But yeah, it is kind of an outlier in that it is distinctly different than what most people kind of think of as like just a design system for a company, because anyone can use material to build a design system.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's almost like, is it still a design system, or is it more about like building your like Android experience or whatever? It's like it's closer to like a platform guidelines rather than really being a design system of a product to me.
Yeah, and because I mean they have like material design like awards that they give applications. And so in that sense it's like much bigger than just like a design system, because all of these like really interesting looking applications are built using material and they all look unique.
For sure. Cool. Anybody has a last question, or maybe somebody in the audience, although it's been quiet? Anybody has a final question before we wrap up and enjoy ourselves for the weekend?
So someone shared with me that there was actually the Edison design system actually received an award, and this is I guess a UX design award. Oh, it's the Webby Awards.
Okay.
This is the first time I've heard of a design system winning awards, and it's like, oh, that's a thing. Yeah, that's I guess again it goes into like that path of like, are we in the slope of enlightenment? We're getting awards. Design systems are getting awards, so I mean that's something.
I mean, should we start to have like design system awards, like best token documentation, best component documentation, and have yearly awards for design systems?
Yeah,
you heard it here first.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big breakthrough idea right there. I think it's interesting because there's even that before like having awards, I feel like also, sometimes I hear the pushback around like, why would we put our design system public? What is the good reason to put your system public? So personally, I have ideas, but what is your opinion on this? Like, first of all, like, do you think that all design systems should be public or not? Or what are the good reasons to have your design system public?
I think there are a lot of good and different reasons to have your design system public. One just could be that you want to kind of show off what you've done and kind of be involved in the community and, get feedback and kind of help out the community. Another could be maybe you do want like other people to kind of use it, similar to like Salesforce Lightning. There are people, there are companies that build Salesforce applications and they use the Lightning design system. So obviously having it kind of be open source and be public is helpful. And another thing could just be like, you want to get your customers or like other people outside of your company involved, like filing issues, giving feedback that could then help building the design system, or you just want people to kind of contribute and kind of be involved. So I think there's a number of different reasons, and lastly, the most important reason being for the clout, to say that you have a cool design system, and for everyone to say it's their favorite design system on a podcast.
Yeah, it's true. But yeah, and at the same time, I feel like this is maybe also why it's still new, and I feel like there's still this idea of like we all trying to figure out what we're doing with this, and so that kind of like push us to actually be vocal and actually share our Legos, because it's like, yeah, like I'm doing it this way. How about you? You know, it's like it's still fairly new. We're still pioneering a lot of stuff, and I feel like this is still like a very open source kind of vibe right now, and where we're all trying to have a conversation open to try to figure out what's what. But yeah, how about you, Donna? How do you feel about that?
Yeah. So TELUS does have like partner vendors that also like create experiences for us. And so one way is like here you have access kind of thing. The other thing too is when you're in a bigger organization, it's hard to kind of share like what is the internal like ways of working, like how do you market to talent kind of thing. And so by really surfacing ways of working and showing our design system, it's a way like, hey, this is how we work, this is how we think about design and development. And that's like a great way to kind of showcase that and market it and then invite people to be part of it. So that's like another reason for us.
Yeah. I think we didn't talk about that too, but I see it as a way to potentially attract talent too. Like, like as you said, Danny earlier, like it's showing off what you're capable of. But at the same time, I feel like I could see potentially, like talent being attracted by saying, oh yeah, like their stuff is really cool, and so obviously you can do that by looking at the product, but also being able to look at behind the scenes, and if you're a professional and wanting to look at how they make the sausage, that actually might be a way for you to like get noticed, and attract talent. Although I don't think I've ever seen any kind of metrics validating this kind of assumption. It's like it's a little bit like when you're selling the design system idea overall. It's like it's probably good for the brand and it's probably going to attract talent if it's good, but it's like, how do you measure that? I'm not so sure. But anyway, cool. Well, we're almost at time, so thanks again, Donna and Danny, to be there with me. It was another very cool and very interesting conversation. Any final words from any of you before you're jumping off to, I don't know, weekend shenanigans?
Thanks for hosting. I know you're not feeling the best, but
that was good. I didn't sneeze today, so that's to me like that's a win. I have a bad cold, and I hope that my personal plan for the weekend is getting rid of this. So yeah, for sure. Thanks, Donna. Okay, well, I'll see you around, guys, and in the meantime, stay fresh. Cheers, guys.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.